from their trip that day, which prompted a bit of a conundrum in the white half of Al-Khalid. Several residents formed search parties to look for the little girl, one of which was Steiny's father. Nothing turned up until the next day when the bodies of both girls were found in a ditch. The bodies were examined by a certain Dr. Asbury Cecil Bozard, who noted that there wasn't a clear sign of struggle, but the girls appeared to have been violently murdered and died from multiple blows to the head. There was a hole in Emma Thames' head, which bore straight into her skull through the forehead, as well as a cut on her right brow, measuring 2 inches in length. For Betty Binnicker, the condition was more or less the same. She'd suffered 7 cranial blows, which shattered the back of her skull, as was discovered in later examinations. Dr. Bozard concluded that both girls' injuries were likely sustained from a round instrument about the size of the head of a hammer. Rumors started to rise in the wake of the girl's death, with one of the prominent ones being that Betty and Emma had called at the home of one of the popular families in the town on the same day they turned up dead. But police never followed up on this trial and no inquiries were made. But when word started to go around from a witness who saw the Steiny kids talking to Betty and Emma, law enforcement officers from Clarendon County swung into action. They showed up at the Steiny residence, where George was promptly put in cuffs and led away. He was held in a small room where he was continuously interrogated for several hours with no witnesses, attorney, or family. After the police had had their fill of the interrogation, one of the law enforcement officers became a sort of figurehead on the case, named H.S. Newman. He put out a handwritten statement about how he arrested George Steiny, who confessed to the murder and disclosed the location of the murder weapon, a 15-inch piece of metal, which he hid in the ditch some 6 feet away from the girls' bicycle. Even after much pressing, Newman refused to give up the location of George's detainment. There were rumors that the boy had been lynched, and even his parents didn't know any better. Meanwhile, the time for his trial was drawing near. I just want to highlight that George was being tried because 14 was considered an age of responsibility at that time, and he was believed to be a perpetrator of a capital crime. 1 month after the girl's demise, the trial of George Steiny Jr. officially started in a courthouse in Clarendon County. The court appointed Charles Plowden as George's attorney, but they might as well not have bothered because Plowden was useless. For the duration of the trial, Plowden didn't present the jury with any evidence or call upon any witness to the stand. Nothing he did even scratched the surface of George's potential innocence. On the other end, the only evidence that was substantial enough to condemn Steiny was the confession the police had allegedly gotten out of him. Unsurprisingly, there were no records of George admitting to murdering Betty Binnicker and Emma Thames. Surely that was enough reason to suspect foul play, right? No, of course not. Because, you know, the most accountable, original, and unbiased piece of information is word of mouth. From his arrest to his trial, George had been cut off from seeing his parents, who were also terrified of being assaulted by the white mob. Not only were they laying low, but they also couldn't show up for their son. So there's 14-year-old George, all by himself with no one but 1,500 white strangers and an all-male, all-white jury, who found him guilty only 10 minutes into deliberation. George was convicted on grounds of first-degree murder of Emma Thames and Betty Binnicker. He was refused an appeal by the court, not that his lawyer tried to push for one anyway. 2 months later, he was sentenced to be killed by electrocution. Even though the white majority seemed to be having their way with George's case, there was some resistance to his eventual execution. Both black and white ministerial unions in South Carolina petitioned the then governor, Olin Johnson, to pursue clemency for Steiny on the grounds of age. At the same time, the governor's office was being berated with telegrams and letters appealing for mercy on behalf of George. But there was an overwhelming similarity among George's supporters, which showed a rather disturbing truth. All the letters and petitions and telegraphs centered on every other thing but the basic grounds of fairness and Christian justice, meaning they all accepted that George was guilty of the charges levied against him. On the 16th of June, 1944, George Steiny Jr., who was held at the South Carolina State Penitentiary, Columbia, was led into the execution chamber. He was dressed in a loose-fitting jumpsuit with a Bible firmly lodged in his armpit. George was only 95 pounds and was too skinny for the electric chair, which was designed for adults. He couldn't fit in the chair, and the state electrician had a hard time adjusting an electrode into his leg. The mask was also too big for George, but at this point, everyone was just so desperate to get it over with. So they slapped it onto his face anyway. The assistant captain asked Steiny if he'd like to confess to the murder in his final words, to which the boy replied, "No, sir." "You don't want to say anything about what you did?" the prison doctor rejoined. Steiny's reply was the same, "No, sir." The switch was flipped, sending 2,400 volts cruising through George's teenage body. The mask was thrown off, revealing George's eyes, wide and teary. Saliva dripped uncontrollably from his mouth for all the witnesses to see. 2 more jolts were administered, and George's earthly troubles were gone with the wind. His death was confirmed shortly afterward, and in just about 83 days, George Steiny Jr. had gone from a boy enjoying the afternoon with his sister to a murderer who was tried, sentenced, and executed by the state of South Carolina. If there's anything we know about the truth, it's that it doesn't always stay unknown. The speed with which Steiny was convicted, as well as his mode of arrest and subsequent lack of evidence at his trial, is proof that a young black child railroaded for sins he didn't commit by an all-white justice system desperate to pin the crime on someone. And even if the case ever made it to light again, any worthwhile evidence was all but gone and many witnesses were dead. But decades later, in 2004, Steve McKenzie and Matt Burgess, both local attorneys, caught wind of George Steiny's case. It piqued their interest how irregular the entire ordeal played out. Post and Courier featured an article in which Burgess pondered the likelihood of Steiny committing such a crime. He asked if it was possible for a teenager of George's build to beat 2 girls to death, who were roughly the same size as him, or how he mustered the strength to move the bodies into the ditch. An even more puzzling question is how a black child in the Jim Crow South could commit such a crime brazenly against 2 white girls during daytime without drawing some attention. A new court hearing began for Steiny's case in 2004, and new evidence was uncovered, including testimonies from George's siblings who were with him during the time of Betty and Emma's murders. His siblings claimed that the police had coerced a confession out of George even though he had an alibi. After the girls rode away from the Steiny kids, George remained with his sister Amy, watching after the family's cattle. Additionally, an affidavit came from the Reverend Francis Batson, who had first noticed the girls lying dead in the ditch and pulled them out to land. Batson recalls in his statement that the ditch wasn't covered in blood, which suggests that the girls may have